That would be great, at least one of the volunteers. So let's go ahead and everyone else shut off their video for the fishbowl.
Two of me shut mine off too, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And I think Chansung was the other volunteer for this.
I'd avoid it.
Okay. So let's share a little bit of what you guys experienced. You know, the questions. Let me put them back up here real quick for me, at least, so I have them in front of me. Thinking of a intercultural hot button moment, why you felt this way, and what of your own behaviors might be irritating to others. So again, when we do this, feel free to talk about your own responses to these questions, or kind of summarize in general your group's discussion around these questions. But we do want to avoid telling other people's stories. That's for them to decide. And as always in these fishbowl, just because you're outside the fishbowl doesn't mean you can't turn on your mic and share as well. So let's just start with, tell me what happened. That's our first Tiagi debrief question. What happened? And you can kind of go from there.
Yes, Dan. Our group, we talk about some behaviors, kind of rude to based on our view of our culture. That we have member talking about she was in Korea, and then for the World Expo, and people night up and try to cut through the line, cutting the line, and that was part of the local culture, but it's kind of offensive to us. It's rude. And later on that also I respond with my personal experiences in China too. It doesn't matter, it's big city, Beijing or Shanghai. If you don't keep closer with another person in a line, and with if we have a bubble distance, then people will just take that spot, saying that, well, this is not a line, there's a, there's a space here, I can just cut it. Things have been changed since 10 years ago. It's getting better now. Also, that I mentioned about that we always believe that in the U.S. that kids can call their parents by their first name, and because we have been influenced by Hollywood movie or some kind of TV episodes stuff, and our partners in the breakout room that say that no, you can't. But we also in Asian culture, we talk about that we cannot call our professors or elder persons first name. We can't. I cannot call my uncle's first name. I cannot call my professor's first name. Is disrespect. Hello, this is respectful. So, but here I think that it's okay. So we mentioned about 20 years ago when first time I went to a conference, and then I tried to help my professor to carry his luggage. He was kind of surprised. After 20 years right now, I'm heading to a conference with my student from another country, and they try to take my backpack, and that surprised me too. So I've changed, but again, that reflects what have happened before 20 years ago. And some of the, I believe some of Asian cultures still have that respect to elder by calling their title or a different special names, or and they try to help them because elder person or professors, they need help, they should walk without any luggage or backpack in Asia. If you have been there, you probably see that professors, nothing with them, backpack no, or something, or students or other junior faculty will take those stuff for them. So they're standing there. So that's part of the culture there, not all, but again, it was our observation. And I think that that reflects on the rudeness. And we talked about indirect person before. And again, that direct is rude. We have to say face. That we have talked about that, discussed that a few meetings ago. That's all I have.
I can share a little bit about our group. Thanks for sharing that.
Yes, thank you.
I piped in first because I had a hot button that came to mind that I use a lot when I am introducing this, having to do with personally being a very loud talker, and the hot button impact of communicating with some of my colleagues in Kenya who are very soft-spoken, and how we've navigated around having each other's hot, we're a hot button for each other. And then the two other colleagues in the room shared, and just from a macroscopic view of this hot buttons experience, and I've noticed this with my students when I do it too. At first, everyone's like, oh, okay, this is a little bit of a hot button for me. And maybe you share, and then it starts snowballing. And I noticed that we kind of had that effect. We each had a similar language-based hot button. And then once we started talking about that, it was like, oh no, I don't have a ton of hot buttons, or this is my particular one. And then we kept feeding off of each other. Like, now that you mentioned this is a language hot button for me. And I've noticed that with my students too. When you start sharing your hot buttons, everyone maybe has one that they're, hold particularly close to their heart and is easy to share. But then once you start hearing other people's hot buttons, it becomes easier and easier to share. Or a lot of times you think of more things that might be hot button issues. And I kind of noticed that even with the three of us. At first, we were a little apprehensive to share a hot button. And then once we started that, it just kind of snowballed away.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
a great fun conversation.
Yeah, those are both really great examples. I'm realizing something a lot more now that I have a young daughter and I'm teaching her some of our cultural norms. The realization that all of those things that we find as rude, I can't say all, but most, are culturally bound, and we don't always think about that. Directness, indirectness, rules about respect, how you speak with someone, all of those things are bound up culturally, and we kind of grow up just assuming that, well, this is universal for everyone. And that's where these come into play when you go into other cultures. They have a completely different set of rules that can be culture shock. And hot buttons, they can push your buttons and trigger you, and then make you all the more sensitive to so many other things that might be hot buttons. So when you were having this conversation with your group, how did you feel sharing these hot button issues, the things that annoy you? Let's just start with those.
We talked about some issues, including I did mention about taking photos, because a lot of people that travel to another country, and again, local people may want to take a picture with you because you look different. So initially it could be offensive and rude. You don't want that. But later on, when you think about it, it's a local culture, it's an opportunity for them to meet with you by taking pictures with you, and that could be acceptable. And of course, in the beginning, that, like you say earlier, our culture is different. So we think that we look into a thing or an issue from a different angle. So could have conflict, but later on we can put ourselves in their shoes, and so we can say, oh, why they want to take a picture with us, and something like that. So there are things that we don't really like, and but there are things that we are able to survive. We think it's okay. We respect that. Like in Beijing or in Seoul, that we walk toward each other and we bump to each other. We just kept going. But in the US, it never happened. The first time you bump into someone, whoever grabbed your shoulder and then try to grab away, and then he can move on, and you feel like this guy is so rude. But you find out that a lot of people are doing that. That means that, okay, it should be okay here. We won't do that, but we think that that's the way they can survive in that populated area. So one thing that is based on our experience, and also our members in the breakout room, and we all have that same feeling.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So thinking about this, one of the questions, how does this relate to the real world? This activity is most frequently been done with students who are going abroad as a way to prepare them for those issues that might be hot buttons for them. But also, even in a more immediate context of students who are traveling abroad, who are going to be sharing a room with another student and, sharing spaces, these things might come up. But thinking about this, putting your teacher hat back on, how might an activity like this be useful when you think about doing this virtually? I mean, you don't have students walking through crowded streets and might bump into people. You don't have them sharing a room or a dorm or a hotel room in these virtual exchanges. How might an activity like this still be useful?
I'm going to butt in. I feel like it's easier to hate people over Zoom because you have like so little personal connection. And so if you don't like the only things you can see about them on Zoom, like how loud they're talking or how much they interject, like I've just interjected here, I feel like you can come to dislike someone in a way that maybe you wouldn't if you were in person and you kind of got more of a sense of their humanity. So in that sense, I feel like talking about like what could be triggering you or being a hot button for you virtually to help people think about how they react to others and how they're viewing them could be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jamie. Ellen, you had something?
I can share. We do this with our students that are going abroad, and we were teaching the course right when the pandemic happened and we went virtual. So we had to adapt this activity to the virtual classroom already. One of the things with the hot buttons we used they could be hot button issues regardless of where they were, but we used the reflective component or the discussion to kind of bring up how it might be different in another environment, or why it might be not a hot button or a hot button somewhere else when it doesn't bother you. So we use that reflection. And then we also had the students input all of their hot buttons in. We created a Qualtrics where they entered their information. So we kind of got a very global view of the whole class, like, wow, the whole class is really annoyed by close talkers, or and it was interesting to see, wow, there's 3 to 5 hot button topics that no one even, had checked at all, yet they, somebody somewhere thinks they're a hot button because they're on this list, and it generated some really good discussion, even though it was virtual.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that. One of the things I'm hoping to address when we get into our creating activities for the virtual space is doing exactly that. So I'm glad, Ellen, you've already had that experience. And please share further when you have those opportunities. Taking an activity that is typically done in person or in the classroom and flipping it into something that can be done in the virtual environment. One of the next questions I want to address is the what if. So specifically, I want to know, would this exercise better increase individual empathy among your students, or would it be more impactful with group harmony among your students? What do you think if you were to use this?
We have not done the virtual format. So we always went there before pandemic, COVID-19. But I'm thinking about transforming those on-site visit or activities using virtual. But before our departure, we have at least 3 different meetings to talk about themselves, talk about our culture, and talk about their culture, or the country we are going to visit, special costumes or whatnot, their holidays. And luckily, we always had some students from those countries. So they are able to come over to the meeting and share something they have. And then as an international students heading back to their country, part of maybe be our tour guide, whatnot, and they are able to share a lot of their information with our students from USA. And that is always very, very helpful before. And in the future, like I said, that we're going to transform to virtual, at least maybe for the next time, and virtual environments. Then I think that I will still do that pre-meetings or again, pre-departure meetings with our students, again, to share their concept or aspects of important knowledge about different cultures.
That's great.
In our class where we do this, I think that the concept of building empathy, some of it depends on the amount of time you have the students to do this activity, whether it can grow into that or it just erupts into like, this bothers me, but how you can actually get to that point in like the debrief and the amount of time using the tool. So I think a lot of it has to do with that, and whether those that are sharing know how well they know each other already. So if you haven't created, like if we when we've done it where we haven't created a safe enough space yet for them to share that with each other, then I think it's harder to get to that empathy, that impact on empathy, because they're much more closed off to sharing. And so I think time and how well they know each other really, definitely I've noticed impacts how successful this is at achieving those goals.
Yeah, and I'm all the more sensitive to exactly what you're describing, because in this setting, we don't have enough time to really go into the debrief as much as I would like to because of all the other things we need to do. But you bring up a really good point with this particular activity, that transition from having them talk about their own hot buttons, things that trigger them, to things that they do that may potentially trigger others. That's a very key point to make that transition in the conversation, so that they can begin to empathize with, wow, I was really upset by those things when I started talking about what triggered me. So now can I start to recognize how the things that I do might have the same effect on others, and begin to develop some of that empathy. So with that, I'm going to invite everyone to come back and join us. And I'm going to share my screen because there's a couple other points that I want to make about this activity. And I'm going to share, bring this up. So this activity is meant to cover empathy and self-awareness. So, starting with self-awareness down here at the bottom, insights into their own cultural rules and biases. So again, having that conversation with them about all of those things that you consider rude, those are rules that were given to you as part of your culture. So if you recognize that, then you can understand that it's contextually based. And when you're in a different context, you have to have that different mindset, the different worldview. So beginning to see your own worldview in that way allows you to expand to be more empathetic, which is the next part, being able to see that other worldview and be supportive of that worldview instead of critical, right? And so that will hopefully reduce some of those anxieties that hot buttons would trigger. The other thing is, aside from self-awareness and empathy, is the emotional resilience. So this is also really good once you have this conversation with students and prepare them for, you're going to have these things that kind of initially you're going to perceive as rude or something that's going to trigger you. But if you can, have some empathy, take a step back and recognize what's happening, you'll be much better prepared to deal with those instances. So dealing with those things that might trigger you is building up that emotional resilience in those scenarios. And certainly in a virtual context, emotional resilience is going to be very, very important. And again, I'm showing again the Tiagi debrief here just as a reminder. This will be up. All of the workshop PowerPoints I will be putting back in the modules, so you can access those there as well. So with that, we're going to go on and get into our discussion about the assessments, our topic for today. So anytime I talk about assessments with a group, I always want to start with some very basic questions. So you can either raise your hand in your camera there, or you can use your reaction button down there for a thumbs up or whatever, if you want to practice that, because that's something to use with your students. Who feels like they know nothing about assessments? They know nothing about them. And I'll admit, before I, really got into all this stuff, I really felt like I didn't know anything. But I do want to reassure you that even if you feel like you're a complete novice and you know nothing about assessment, I guarantee you know more than you realize. So who has used one of these assessment tools before? And if you have, which assessment tool? I'd love to hear from some of you on what assessment tools you've used in your classes.
Dan,
Yep.
I didn't use those tools that you have introduced. Those are very good. I pick up two that I will use in the future. But before, we simply use focus group after every day's activities, and we get together and talk about what I have learned and what have you seen, and what's a surprise or a cultural shock to you, and before they go to bed. So I use only focus group because everyday activities, we had a lot of activities. So by the time of 9 or 10, that either they will be invited to go to outside to the bar by local people, friends, or they have to go to bed to sleep because they were exhausted. So I just use quick focus group for 2 groups, and then try to facilitate each group for the 20 minutes, and so they can refresh what I have learned, what I've seen, and that's about it. But I don't have any kind of mechanism that to measure before and after, or some kind of documentation that I can show people at all. But we use Facebook. We update Facebook using VPN and go through Facebook, and we can update photos and whatnot there. And those are still there. And again, as students are maintaining it, I hope. I don't know, but we use that. It's a good platform.
Yeah, and definitely reflection tools like that are really great assessment tools, especially as formative assessment. And we're going to talk about these different types. I have to cover some things that many of you may be very knowledgeable about. And again, as I said from the beginning of this workshop series, you all are the experts in the room. You all are the ones doing these programs and doing assessments. So I do want to, make sure that you feel comfortable sharing your own expertise in these settings. So some things to think about when you're trying to figure out what assessment tool to use. How do you evaluate an assessment tool as being a good tool or a bad tool? What's appropriate or inappropriate? So there are some criteria that you can begin to look at. So first of all is the type of assessment that you want to use. And I presented this in the module. Is it an assessment of learning? So is it a summative assessment? So you've done an intervention or an activity or some instruction, and at the end, you're going to test them. You're going to assess how much did they learn, right? So assessment of learning, and then there's assessment for learning. So this is that formative assessment. And this is kind of that intermittent assessment where you're having them reflect back on that activity or that intervention, whatever it is that they experienced, and kind of walk through it, have some discussion about it, reflect on it, and get feedback. And it's that feedback of that reflection assessment that is that formative assessment, or can be. That's one example of that. And then finally, assessment as learning, which is you're using an assessment tool of some kind to teach them something. So a really good example that I use all the time is the IDI. They take the assessment, we get the results, and then you have an individual debrief. And through that debrief, they're gaining self-awareness. They're learning about themselves, and they're learning how to have more control over their behaviors through that. So that is assessment as learning. And there's a number of different assessment tools that help with doing that as well. Then there's also different approaches to how you're using those. For example, holistic versus component approaches. So, and again, an example of this would be, do I want to just focus in on one component, thinking of the AAC&U rubric for intercultural knowledge and competence? Do I want to just focus on empathy, or do I, on the scale of the IDI, want to look at this holistic intercultural development, which may include all of those skills and competencies that are in that AAC&U rubric? Then there's direct versus indirect measurements. So again, if you have students do reflective essays, you might use the rubric, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, to assess those kinds of writings. So that would be kind of an indirect approach to assessment. So you're looking for particular competence levels within that. Then you have quantitative versus qualitative methods. So whether you're having students write essays as part of their assessment, or just filling out Likert scale surveys to get quantitative data. And then there's issues, specific criteria that we're going to look at of assessment tools, like things like face validity. And that's specifically when a test taker is reading the questions, can they figure out from reading them what they're really being tested on, right? So that would be high face validity. If it's very easy to tell, oh, this is asking me a question about my empathy, I can then change my answer to match what I think the person wants to hear, right? So an assessment that has high face validity you have that performative aspect that may interfere with honest answers. So those are things to consider when you're selecting a specific assessment. So to look at some of these criteria a little more closer, I'm going to share my screen again. And this is a table that is up in the module that some of you may have already taken a look at. But across the top, we have these different intercultural assessment tools. So the value rubrics, the BEVI, the CQ, the IDI, the IES, and then the ASKS 2+. Those are the different ones that are covered in this table. And then the criteria, what is the medium? So how is the assessment tool delivered? And it's certainly, going entirely online virtual, that's a very important consideration because, if you find an assessment tool that's only available as a PDF that you can print out and have students fill out, you might have to make some changes to that so that they can access it virtually and fill it out and submit it virtually. Thankfully, we have things like Qualtrics where you can quickly convert those things into something that's fillable. Then you have length. How long is the assessment? Because you get assessment fatigue, right? If it's a very long assessment, it may be very valid and reliable, but are your students going to be willing, for example, to sit down for the BEVI and take a 185 question Likert scale survey? It depends. And then you've got, I've already talked about face validity. Cost is a very real factor. I've asked that question a number of times. Do you have funding available to purchase these assessments, or do you need to pass that on to your students, or do you need to rule it out entirely? If it costs money, I can't do it, right? Because that's a reasonable thing that you need to consider. Then specifically, is this a tool that requires a debrief? So is it a tool that when you get the results, the student can just look at it and they know what it's telling them? Or do they need to sit down with you one-on-one, or maybe even doing a group debrief to explain what the results mean? So that's an important factor in deciding on which tool to use. And with that, do you need special training in order to effectively debrief that tool? So for example, the IDI, you're required to either be an IDI QA, been qualified administrator of the assessment, or have access to people who are qualified administrators. Thankfully, here at Purdue, you yourself do not have to be a QA. We have a calendar that you can request access to, where you say, I have, 80 students in this course. I want them all to take the IDI. They all need individual debriefs. Can I send them to you this coming semester? That gets approved, and then you just pass that link on to your students, and they can make appointments with qualified administrators to get debriefed. Unfortunately, we don't have that for all assessment tools, but the IDI, that's one that we promote and use a lot, and there are a lot of units that use it, so we saw demand there. We have over 100 qualified administrators on Purdue's campus. So that's a luxury that Purdue has that many other universities do not. So then the next part, and this is relevant to each of you as you're trying to decide which tool to use, what does it measure? So here it has a breakdown of each of these assessment tools and specifically what it measures. And then there's further information provided down at the bottom. So these are all things that you'll need to consider. And I have that assignment that is in Module 6 that is going towards answering some of these questions. Do you have money? Or do you need to select one that is free? Do you need to have it debriefed? What time frame? How are you going to administer it? Things like that. So the next thing I wanted to do was provide some examples of what this looks like after an assessment. And this will come up again when we get into data analysis. So for example, this is this is a report, a table from one of the reports where the AAC&U Intercultural Knowledge and Competence Value rubric was used. So students wrote essays, their program leaders used the rubrics to assess those writings, and they did a comparison with the control group who got no intercultural training versus one that did the following year. And they compared in these three categories: curiosity, self-awareness, and openness. So this is not a straightforward pre and post that you would do with the same group, but comparing to a group that got no intervention whatsoever. Then we have the BEVI, And the Bevy, 185 questions, it gives you 17 different categories of information. So questions about fulfillment of their core needs, so about their identity or needs fulfillment in general, tolerance of disequilibrium, so their basic openness or self-certitude. So that is similar to intercultural openness, kind of having that self-confidence to be open. Critical thinking, self-access, other access, global access. So those also can line up with the ACNU with openness and empathy and self-awareness. But this is a different tool. It gets at, the really interesting thing about the Bevy is all the questions in the Bevy actually came from a very long study where they took specific statements from actual subjects. So these aren't made up questions or made up statements. They're actual statements that people made, and they used them to construct this assessment tool. So, and you know, you'll have multiple people that said basically the same thing in different words, but they condensed it down into a specific statement for this assessment. So that's a really interesting aspect of this. And there's also built into this an understanding that of how people form their identities using their values and belief systems. And if they want to change, they have to sort of damage or break some of that rigidity that they've developed in their life in order to have those kind of pivotal or transformational moments that allow them to grow further. Because as we get older, we sort of solidify our values and beliefs. And that's something that this discusses with students as well. The next one is, this is some data from my own study using the IDI. I had 376 participants, multiple semesters, but basically this is broken down into a control group. And all of these stats here are the combination of pre and post. What was the average growth? So we had a control group, and we had those students who received individual mentoring and a group that received group mentoring. So one mentor for a larger group of students as opposed to one-on-one. So of course you can see, well, hopefully you can see the color is not very bright. The control group has a lot of stasis at 61.5%, meaning between their pre-test and their post-test, there was no discernible growth or movement at all. That was the biggest percentage. Whereas in the individual and in the large group, stasis was much less, and there was far more progression of an IDI orientation, so a full stage of growth, 1 stage, 2 stage, 3 stage, and even 4 stage growth in this group, which you had only 1 or 2 stages of growth with your control group. So then the next thing is just taking a look at how could I use something like a rubric to assess my students, right? And again, this can be used just as a summative. I've given them an intervention. I've asked them to write an essay about their experience, and maybe your essay prompt might include something that gets them to talk about the empathy they might have developed towards that particular culture. And then you can use this rubric and this one of those specific competencies like empathy and look for statements in their writing that might demonstrate that they, for example, recognize the emotional dimensions of more than one worldview. That would be milestone level 3 of empathy, as opposed to the capstone, which is not only are they able to do that, but they're able to interpret their intercultural experience from more than one perspective, their own and another worldview. And they can also be supportive. So using those levels to determine what are those statements, so finding those statements that kind of illustrate some kind of empathy, and then comparing those to these descriptions. What kind of empathy is that? Is it a level 2, a level 3, a level 4? And then from that, you can kind of have quantitative scores or an average for that essay and say, okay, I believe this student, maybe 1 or 2 statements demonstrated capstone, but by and large, they were really, most of the statements showing me that they're at level 3. So I'm going to give this one a level 3. And then you can do that for each student. So that's just another example of assessment that you can do using the rubrics with qualitative data. So, and I'm going to stop sharing with this. Before we get into the wrap-up part, as I'm pulling up the hub here to share with you all, does anyone have questions or comments about what I've covered thus far? And I'm also noticing a few of you have mentioned that you've used the IDI as well as the CQ and the IES, and that's really great. I'd love to hear your thoughts on either the IDI. There's certainly criticisms of the IDI, and that's something else to consider. What are the advantages and disadvantages of those assessments?
I have a question. I haven't done much assessment at all. Are these assessments generally, I looked at some of them on the Hub ICL and they all seem to be self-report based. Is that just how these are and we're just assuming the students are not lying or anything like that?
There are a lot of assessments that are self-reporting. We do ask the students to be honest with us. Now, one way, I don't know that you can ever truly get around that. Any kind of self-reporting assessment is going to have that performative aspect to it. But I think it helps to have a conversation with your students about that and say, it's not going to be helpful to anybody if you just answer this with what you think I want you to say, right? I think that's a valid conversation to have with students. The other thing is I highly recommend an approach that is called the post-retro-pre. And that is where you administer the assessment at the end. You don't do a pretest. You do your intervention, your activity, your lesson, and at the end of it, you administer this assessment as a post. And you have them answer the questions, thinking about, now that I've gone through this, what do I understand in relation to these questions? And then after they've completed that, then have them retake the same assessment, but do it with the frame of mind of thinking back to before they had that lesson, before they had the activity. What do they think, where do they think they were? How would they rank themselves prior? And what that does is a lot of times when you give people those very high face validity self-reporting assessments at the beginning, they rank themselves very high in everything. And then you give them a post test and there's no movement because again, they rank themselves very high. But if you do it as a post and a retro pre, you tend to get more informed responses on the retro pre of, oh, now I better understand this. And I couldn't rank myself higher because obviously I know more now than I did before we started. Does that help?
To some extent. I think that
To
helps
some
with
extent.
its own questions of validity, but it's an interesting idea. I hadn't heard of that before.
And yeah, and that's meant to kind of address the
Yeah.
problem, the problem of using those. It doesn't necessarily address your question of, do we have something else? There are those that are not self-reporting that are very, very low face validity assessments out there. And if that's really what you feel strongly about and want, that's something that we can help you try to find that's appropriate to your scenario. That's an excellent question.
I have a question
Yes.
for self-reporting. Does it require IRB for students to do their report?
That's a really good question. So my understanding is you will not need an IRB if you are, or if you can, let's put it in these terms. If you can reasonably argue that you're using the assessment as program assessment, and then later decide you want to go back and use it as some other form of research to use that data. You can do that retroactively, submit to IRB to use data that you originally used as program assessment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's kind of a loophole in the IRB.
I see.
Okay, so, and please feel free to jump in with other questions you have. I am going to share my screen again because I do want to show you all how you can find some of these assessments on your own. So going to the, and this is always a problem for me because they put the controls right over what I want to do. But if you go to the hub, you can go navigate to the toolbox, and I'll just do it all in this one instead of pulling it up. Once you get into the toolbox, you're looking for an assessment tool. So the first thing I would do is go to the tool type, click on assessments, And then down here, if you were using one of these criteria, let's say empathy, but you can of course put in more than one, you can just search based on that and it will return, whoops, of course it's already signed me out again. Apologies. Hang on for just 1 minute. All the wonderful technical issues of trying to do these things live. Try and get back in here. Okay, so I think I'm back in now. Let me try this again. Okay, apologies. So I searched assessments and empathy, and I have a very long list here. It's also giving me times. If you see a book out here to the side, these come with a lesson plan that goes along with the assessment tool. You could look at any one of these. You know, for example, the MGoods is fairly popular. Gives you the source where it comes from, tells you right off the top what it's measuring. So diversity of contact. So this is starting out using the terminology that MGoods themselves have used to describe their own outcomes or what they measure. But we've also kind of aligned it with the AAC&U Intercultural Knowledge and Competence Value Rubric. So diversity of contact would be like curiosity, relativistic appreciation of differing others would be empathy, and then this final one, comfort with difference, would be openness. This one does not have downloads or links, but it does tell you what the materials are. But you do have links here where you can get to printout of the instrument. This one, I would actually recommend taking the printout and turning it into a Qualtrics, although I've not used it myself. And as with any tool, there's going to be notes here on how to use it. You know, this is from our perspective. This is what we've done or what people who have used the MGoods have done. And then, of course, some of the theoretical frameworks we align for this particular tool. So I can see this one covers openness, curiosity, and empathy. It works great with all orientations. If you're using the IDC, if you've used the IDI previously and you happen to know those. And it's really good for diversity, equity, and inclusion subjects. You can do this with any of the tools. Let me see if I can get back into. Yeah, you can do this with any of the tools. It'll provide you that information. Of course, you can search any of these others. We do also have tags where you could just search by tag. If for example, there is a framework that you're using that doesn't align with the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, you could just use tags to search for, you know, social justice assessments, and you know, we can try that and see what comes up. I'm doing this one live, so rolling the dice if we have one in here, and see what comes up for us. Fair trade learning rubric. So this, of course, this would be geared towards using the rubric to assess probably qualitative data, but that's just one example. So, anyone else? Questions, thoughts, criticisms?
Dan, is the expectation that we use one of these assessments or for the purpose of this program, or can we make up our own assessments?
You're welcome to make up your own assessment. Our only request is that it be one of those framework. It's, you know, you have your own discipline, the content of your course that you're assessing. We want to make sure that you're also assessing these other areas, whether it's diversity and inclusion, intercultural competence is the big one for us. But you're welcome to make up your own assessments. And certainly a lot of you are doing those qualitative assessments where you're looking at essays, and you don't have one of those, just a survey assessment tool. You're not required to use those. I've heard from many of you about which assessments you'd like to use in a trial run to learn more about. Please make sure that you let me know if you haven't already. If there's a tool you have no experience with that you'd like to learn more about, I will make sure you get a copy of it so you can take it yourself and experience that from the student perspective. just so that you can evaluate it, whether you choose to use it or not. Okay. We've run out of time. As always, I'll stick around for a few minutes if you have more questions. But if not, thank you all for joining in today. Have a good one.
I do have a question for you.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think I missed, I think it was Professor Liu. I'm not sure who was asking the question about the 3-to-1 ratio for the,
Before we started?
and I think you were saying you may not know the answer. So I may be asking the same thing that you're not aware of, but you know, I've done one of those before, and I was working with Dr. Sheffield, and now I'm working on this SAIL grant now. And I'm kind of hung up on that. I know I have that $2,000, you know, from the IPG from before that, you know, is in his account. Dr. Burbank has given the approval for me to go forward. And so do I make assumptions with that? If the department head is like, yeah, go forward, does that mean, you know, he or she automatically knows, hey, there's money involved and I'm okay with that? Or do you know?
Yeah, I think that's a safe assumption. Certainly I would double check before any money is spent, but
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a safe assumption. Those things have been approved. You've wrapped these things up, you know, from last year. You've got this year's IPG. You know, barring just absolutely having to drop out of everything, I don't see any reason why that funding wouldn't come through for you. So, but yeah, I would definitely double check with John and your home unit and make sure you have specific amounts of budget to work with.
Okay. Because that's the only thing I'm hung up on, you know. You know, are there numbers that are crazy for this? Because my sale, I believe, is San Diego, and some of the, you know, flights and hotel and all that. You know, I think it's going to be for 16 students around 24,000. So, you know, a third of that would be $8,000. If $8,000 is what we get for a 14-day or more event, do I count on that $8,000, or does that mean, no, the $8,000 goes into the other part of it, you know, 16,000, and then the department still has to provide the 1/3.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
Yeah, I think those are definitely questions for your.
Okay.
For your unit. So,
Okay.
I'm sorry I can't be more of help for that. But
Well, I didn't know if there was just something generic with that, or if it just depended on. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yep. Great session. Thank you.
see you, Stu.
Yeah.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Dan. I had a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
If you
Sure.
don't mind. Actually, I decided I had two questions after hearing Stu talk. I put in for the CQS to look at that one,
Yep.
but there's a cost with it, right?
Let me pull it up because I don't know off the top of my head, but I do have it handy. CQS, it's listed as $35 per student.
Okay, and I would pay for that out of the IPG funding is the idea? Is that how that?
So the IPG always comes after everything's over,
Right.
right? So that's something else to consider. You know, the funding for IPG is not distributed until after the program is finalized. And that includes running your program and submitting a data analysis report. So the assumption is that you would already do that.
Okay.
That being said, there might be some ways to you know, see if international programs could subsidize, or your home department. Yeah, it would be just a matter of asking around. I know that others have had success with getting some subsidizing from Dean Brzezinski.
And the IDI, remind me, the IDI, because we have the resources on campus for that, that also has a cost with it though as well.
Yeah,
right?
so the IDI is $12 per student, and
Okay.
each time. So if you were to do it as a pre and post, that would be $24 per student.
Okay. Okay, sorry, that was not my original question, but it's something to start thinking about. My other question, if you don't mind, if you have just a sec.
You're not limited to questions. You can ask as many as you like.
Okay, you talked about the rubrics as a summative assessment, right, of writing, but I'm wondering if I want to use that pedagogically, like, do you have examples of that? Because I'm wondering if I can, like, you know, there's of course feedback, right, and having them kind of do it more than once. But I was just kind of curious if you have examples of employing those rubrics in a more pedagogical way throughout the class.
Yeah, and actually, it's a shame you didn't get a chance. I don't know if you've met Tatiana Babich-William. She is in the Italian department, and she's been doing some intercultural training with her students. They've embedded it into their beginning level Italian courses, 101 through I think 202, and they use the rubrics as formative, as part of their instructions. Excuse me, pedagogical. So they built it into the instruction. They begin with introducing a particular competence out of that rubric, and they devote class time to teaching the students about the language in there and what it means to have intercultural empathy, for example. They do one competence at a time. I think they do two throughout a whole semester. And they even, from section to section, revisit the competencies from the previous semester. So they introduce it. They have conversations about the rubric at different levels. And then they have the intervention where they do an activity with them. So the students are very aware of how that activity goes with that particular set of learning outcomes. It's all explicit. And then they have a debrief, and they might have a reflection assignment where they write an essay, and the rubric is also used to assess that writing. So the students are very familiar with it, even before they have their intervention, before they have their lesson.
Yeah. Okay. So you make it explicit throughout. And then what kinds of intervention are we talking about?
So yeah, so I'm using intervention in the research term, just any activity or lesson you might give that targets that specific learning outcome. So for us, if you were to use the digital toolbox to seek out an empathy activity, that would be one of your interventions. And you're, doing danger of a single story, and then, debriefing that activity after they've watched that video and had a discussion, debriefing it. All of that would be your intervention.
But those are usually conceived of as these kind of toolbox interventions of exercises, like what we've been doing with the hot button, things like that. It's not necessarily like a disciplinary based cultural learning activity.
Right. So everything that we're offering through the toolbox, well, not everything, but most that we do, and most of the things that Silmar goes out and provides in that regard, is focusing on intercultural competence, and specifically in that understanding of intercultural competence being broadly non-culture specific, right? There's cultural general competency versus cultural specific competency.
Okay.
So yeah, but I do want to say you're not limited to that. I mean, this is just one example of doing that general cultural approach. Tatiana has done a really good job at taking those cultural general activities and customizing them to her discipline, to Italian culture, and using that to, she reworked I don't know if you're familiar with the DIE activity, describe, interpret, evaluate.
I've done that.
Yeah, and she's taken out all those pictures that we use to have them describe and inserted something specific from Italian culture that allows her to talk about that cultural behavior, that cultural practice or value, while she's also doing this intercultural skill building.
Okay.
So you can customize these the culture general activities to be culture specific.
Okay. All right, good. Thanks. That
Thought I
helped.
could help.
Yeah.
Well, if anything else occurs to you, don't hesitate to contact me.
Okay. Thanks,
Glad to
Dan.
help. Have a good one.
See you later.
Bye.